What's going on, everyone? This is the Noah Gillian Show, and I, of course, am your host, Noah Gillian. So happy you decided to join in today. It is the 12th of June, 2023, and on today's episode, we are going to start a new series on the pod. So today, we're going to be looking back at my rankings for fantasy football from last season. So one thing that, if you guys have been listening to this show for long enough, you understand that one of my most important, one of my more reliable, what's the word I'm looking for? One of the things I think is really valuable, especially in someone who talks about sports and who puts together certain lists of rankings, if you will, is transparency, is understanding reasoning, is understanding process, is figuring out how you got to a certain point, because I believe that the process is so much more important than any result you could ever get. This is outside of sports in general. This is more of a life thing. But keeping it in the sports realm, I think that having a sound process is one of the most important things you can do. And in my space here on my podcast, I think it's important to go back and look at what I did in 2022, in the summer of 2022, and look at my ranks, and now that we have a full season to go off of, not just look back at the quarterback position, because I could come on this series, right, and I could start it off and I could say, listen, this is how all the quarterbacks in the NFL finished last year, right? I could come on and say, Patrick Mahomes was the number one quarterback, Josh Allen was the number two quarterback, Jalen Hurts was the number three quarterback, yada, 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 right down the list. And I could tell you why they finished there, right? But everybody watched. Like, anybody that's watching this understands, or at least for the most part, watched football last year. Everyone kind of understands who did well and who didn't do well. But I think it's important to go back even before the end of the season and go into your prep for last season, because we're starting to get to that time of year where the prep for this season is beginning. And what are you if you're not improving your process and you're not learning? Because that is the most important thing you can do. Nobody has all the answers. And I think going back, looking at your process, understanding why you made certain decisions, and understanding the reasoning behind certain decisions, I think that is how you get better, right? That's how you grow. That's how you learn. And that's how it really gets done. Like, that's how the sausage is made. And for me, last couple of years, actually, the last 2 years, I've actually ranked fantasy positions going into the season. I'm actually flipping back to see if I can find my 2021 ranks as we talk here, because I had my running backs, I had my fantasy wide receivers, and pretty interesting ranks, just going through them and year to year, seeing where I kind of lean, what kinds of players I favor, and I just think that's really important. So, with all that being said, we are going to get into this season's fantasy football audit, if you will, for the quarterback position. So, starting off with my ranks from last year, I made two different types of sets of ranks. I did one in July, and I also did one in August. I think as the summer goes on, I did this on I did this on July 12th last year, my first set of rankings. And I did another set of rankings on the 7th of August. So almost a full month in between. And, there was a lot of similarities, but there was also things that changed, which I think is pretty interesting. And toward the end of this episode, I'm going to kind of compare lists and maybe see what I was thinking changing some guys around. So let's start off with just my final ranks, my final preseason ranks for the quarterback position that I did last year. And I wrote some takeaways down, so we'll kind of go through them like that. All right. So the number 1 and number 2 quarterbacks I had on my list last year was number 1, Josh Allen, and number 2, Patrick Mahomes, right? Reasoning here, pretty easy. One of the guys, and I said, is Patrick Mahomes, right? The best quarterback in the league. And the other guy in Josh Allen was coming off 2 consecutive seasons as the number 1 quarterback in fantasy football. So I loved what I was seeing. They were ascending teams. Obviously, the Chiefs had already reached the mountaintop and they've stayed at that level. But the Bills have been an ascending team. Josh Allen has been an ascending player. And what do you know? The top 2 finish as the top 2. Obviously not patting myself on the back from that. It wasn't really that. I didn't go out on a limb saying that Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen were going to be the 2 best fantasy football quarterbacks last year. However, that's just how the cookie crumbled. I had Josh Allen first and Mahomes second. Mahomes ended up finishing first and Josh Allen finished second. And it was about by a 17-point margin, only about 1 fantasy point per game. So it was really a toss-up there. Obviously, with Patrick Mahomes, you're getting a lot more through the air, a lot more yards. He threw for 5,200 yards and 41 touchdowns. Josh Allen threw for 4,300 yards and 35 touchdowns. The reason Josh Allen made up so much ground, he had over 400 more rushing yards and 3 more rushing touchdowns than Patrick Mahomes. And definitely keep a bookmark on what I just said there at the end, because that is going to be a monster thing that we need to keep on our minds going through the quarterback position. So, the next quarterback I had on my list, number 3, was Justin Herbert. Now, coming into the year, I was all in on the Chargers. Matter of fact, I'm going to look at my NFL prediction preview. I had the Chargers making the playoffs. I was really, really in on Justin Herbert breaking out completely last year. And I was wrong on the Chargers. They didn't have a great year, despite and what I just mentioned with Allen and Mahomes with the rushing and how Josh Allen kind of made up some of the ground there. Let's talk about Justin Herbert, right? Why was a quarterback that finished second in the entire league in passing yards with 4,700 passing yards? Why did he finish as quarterback 11? Barely a quarterback 1, right? So let's talk about it. Justin Herbert only threw 25 touchdowns last year. Just looking at the list here, I can see about 8 to 9 players just from the top that threw more touchdowns than him, right? But that's not really, saying too much. He threw for 25 touchdowns, right? Trevor Lawrence finished as the number 8 quarterback last year, also threw 25 touchdowns. But let's keep scrolling over. Why did Trevor Lawrence also had, we'll use him as the example here. He also had 600 less passing yards, right? So the same amount of touchdown passes and 600 less passing yards. How was he number 8 and Justin Herbert was number 11? Well, here we go. Justin Herbert had 147 rushing yards last year and 0 touchdowns. So that's 14 fantasy points from the ground total for Herbert. Trevor Lawrence, on the other hand, ran for 291 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. So that's 29 points from the yards, and that's 30 points from the touchdowns. So you're already seeing he got an extra 50, what is that? 59 points. And Justin Herbert only had an extra 14 points from the ground. So that's where you kind of see that discrepancy. Justin Herbert finished with 291 fantasy points. Trevor Lawrence finished with 303. So there's only a 12-point difference, 12-point difference in their fantasy point total. But you see how Trevor Lawrence made up so much ground on Justin Herbert. It was the ground. And that is where, as we make our way through my rankings, you'll see a lot of names that I pushed up there that frankly didn't perform. But the reasoning behind it is where I thought, and the Herbert rank I think, a little bit aggressive now looking back at it. But in my defense, putting myself back in 2022, the Chargers ascending offense, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Austin Eckler, just loaded up with offensive skill position players. And this is a guy who is one of the best pure passers of the football in the league. Just absolutely dominates with his arm. He absolutely just gets the job done and throws the ball just about as good as anybody in the league, right? So that is the reason why he didn't quite take that next step, despite having the second most passing yards in the entire NFL, only behind Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes was the only quarterback in the league to throw more yards than Justin Herbert, and yet Justin Herbert was a fringe quarterback one. And the fact that, let's talk about those two guys real quick. Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert. Patrick Mahomes ran for 358 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground. So ran for way more than Trevor Lawrence and had 4 touchdowns on the ground. And you might not think of Patrick Mahomes as a rushing quarterback, but he gave himself a chance. He only ran the ball 7 more times. He only had 7 more attempts than Justin Herbert did last year. But what did he do? He was more efficient with his runs. He scored touchdowns, is a huge reason for that. And that is what, ultimately can propel these guys. So Justin Herbert, I had at number 3, was a big miss for me. Let's just be 100% honest. I had him at 3 and he finished at 11. Just an absolute whiff. I'm going to clump the next 2 guys in together as we make our way down here. Number 4, I had Lamar Jackson. And number 5, I had Kyler Murray. Now, Kyler Murray ended up finishing 19th among fantasy quarterbacks. He played 11 games, so a little bit more than I actually kind of thought. Easily the least amount of games in the top 24. No other quarterback had less than, Dak Prescott played 12 games and he finished right next to him. But you kind of see where those guys kind of fell down the ranks. Lamar Jackson ended up playing only 12 games as well. So you kind of see Kyler only played 11, Lamar only played 12. It really hurts when you're talking about the top 5 at the position. Just looking at the top 5 who ended up finishing that way, the only quarterback who didn't play a full season was Jalen Hurts. And he was still a top 5 guy. Just shows you the level of Jalen Hurts last year. And even Justin Fields only played 15 games last year. He was number 6. Nobody else in the top 8 played less than 17 games. Nobody else in even the top 13 played less than 16 games. So you're kind of seeing where the injuries took a factor there. But let's also just talk about their seasons, right? Lamar struggled mightily. And I think a lot of that has to do with the offense. I was really in on Baltimore last year. I was all over Baltimore to do really well. Even after they struggled to start the year, I was expecting a big come. And they started, that wasn't quite accurate. Lamar started really hot last year and then kind of tapered off and was a little tough to go. Still ran for 764 yards. So when you're talking about, Kyler Murray being a little bit further it down, a guy in Dak Prescott also who got hurt, threw for way more yards than Lamar, didn't quite run for as much. Lamar still ran for 764 yards and 3 touchdowns, but only threw for 2,200 yards, 17 touchdowns, only played 12 games, right? Still averaged 20 fantasy points a game, right? So if we're talking fantasy points per game, was a top 5 option at the position. So that's where it kind of gets tough with some of these ranks. If Lamar played a full season, could he have been the number 4 quarterback? If we're talking points per game, he was the number 5, right? So that one's a little questionable. Kyler Murray, on the other hand, he averaged 18.9 fantasy points per game. And when you start to talk about that, that's a top 10 figure, right? So although he finished at number 19, only playing 11 games, when he was in there, he was giving you good numbers. Obviously not quite what he gave you maybe in 2021, but still delivered in a sense when he was on the field. Just wasn't there enough. And overall, kind of took a big hit for teams that took him. Kyler Murray was the 6th quarterback off the board in terms of average draft position. last year, and yeah, that hurt. Lamar Jackson was the number 4 quarterback in terms of average draft position for quarterbacks. And just, continuing with what we're talking about, Justin Herbert was the number 3 quarterback in terms of average draft position. So those guys really struggled to turn the value that you had to spend on there. As we kind of move through the list here, I had Jalen Hurts at number 6. Let's go. Our Lord and Savior here in Philadelphia, Jalen Hurts, absolutely balled TF out. He was the number 7 quarterback off the board here. He was going 65th overall around there. So, it wasn't like a stretch to have Jalen Hurts this high. I really wanted to push him higher. Like, I just remember as I'm looking at these, I can remember I wanted to put him over Kyler. I wanted to put him over Lamar. And I just couldn't bring myself to honestly put my name behind it. And maybe that's also something that I can take out of this, right? I can understand, listen, I was really, really high on Jalen Hurts, but maybe my bias, it was almost a reverse bias, right? Maybe my bias as an Eagles fan, I was like, no, I don't want to push him too high. I don't know if I'm being biased for my own fandom here. But Jalen Hurts ended up being the number 3 quarterback in all of fantasy, and he played 2 less games than everybody else. He finished with, 16-12? That's 28. He finished 28 points behind Josh Allen, and he played 2 less games. Just for context, he averaged 25.6 fantasy points per game last year, and that was, drum roll please, number 1 of all fantasy quarterbacks. So I am going to have Jalen Hurts much, much higher. He has joined Mahomes and Allen in that top tier, and there's nothing else really to say about Jalen Hurts because he absolutely balled out, and he is fantasy gold. Mainly because of that rushing. Let's talk about it real quick. 760 yards, 13 touchdowns on the ground. 13 touchdowns. He had 600 less yards than Josh Allen through the air. He had 1,500 less yards than Patrick Mahomes through the air. That's 100. Oh, wait, no, it's not. The math, I can't do that math in my head. But he threw for 1,500 less passing yards. He threw for 19 less passing touchdowns. Can you grasp that real quick? 1,500 passing yards and 19 touchdowns. Patrick Mahomes also threw 6 more interceptions. So that's another minus 12, right? So we're getting all that in our head right here. Jalen Hurts still, because he ran for 400 more yards, because he scored 9 more touchdowns than him, averaged more fantasy points per game than the number 1 quarterback in fantasy football last year. So Jalen Hurts is a legit cheat code. Sorry for getting on my soapbox there. I had to give some love to my boy because he is an absolute beast. All right, let's move on. Number 7. And this one hurts. This one hurts the soul. Russel Wilson was my number 7 fantasy quarterback. He finished number 16. All right. He averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game. The Denver Broncos were the least prolific offense in the NFL. They may have scored the least amount of touchdowns of any team. And guess who had him in the Super Bowl? Me. Haha. You're really smart, Noah. Yeah, I know. Thanks. So, why? I literally wrote why under this. And I want to ask myself that question. So let's talk about it. Why did I have Russell Wilson at number 7? As we consult the ADP, Russell Wilson was the 8th quarterback off the board in terms of fantasy quarterbacks last year. So was a consensus top 8, top 10 player at the position. And just looking at the ADP here, Jalen Hurts was going around 65 overall. He was the 7th quarterback off the board. Russell Wilson was the 72nd overall pick on average last year. He was the 8th quarterback. You have Tom Brady, 75 overall, was the number 9 quarterback. And then you have Dak Prescott at 89, was the 10th quarterback off the board in terms of average draft position. So there was definitely a tier break after Russell Wilson. Wilson was included in the Hurts and Brady tier. Why? Denver They go out and they make a splash deal for Russell Wilson. They bring him in. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I said, this is a straight Tampa Bay situation. When Tom Brady went to Tampa Bay, all they needed was a quarterback. They had a great defense. They had stud wide receivers. They had a great running game and a good offensive line. And I was like, listen, you insert a Hall of Fame quarterback into those ingredients, you're going to get lucky and you're going to get good quick. And what do you know? Javonte Williams, stud running back. Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, legit 3 dominant receivers. They also draft KJ Hamler in the second round out of Penn State last year. Weapons on the outside. Good offensive line, wasn't great, but good. They went out and they made some big pickups this offseason on the offensive line. So we'll see how much I buy back into that. Definitely going to have to see some camp reports. But offense, and then their defense was great. So they're going to have lots of opportunities to get the ball, right? And what happened? We talk about our process so often, and our process in this one led us astray. So why? Why did it lead us astray? Well, number one reason we could potentially point to is Nathaniel Hackett as the head coach. First-time head coach, was not even an offensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. Don't quote me on that. Regardless, he was a coach for the Green Bay Packers. They brought him to Denver because they thought they were going to get Aaron Rodgers and that he would have a good relationship with him. So right off the bat, maybe I was drinking way too much of the Nathaniel Hackett Kool-Aid, and he just, at the end of the day, wasn't ready. He didn't even see the end of his first season. He got fired because it was so bad. And a first-year head coach, had never been a coordinator, and then he's asked to lead this team. There's definitely some right to reserve judgment on those types of players. So as we go through the offseason this year, I'm going to be looking at first-year head coaches. This is something I'm going to add to my process now. When I'm ranking these quarterbacks, I honestly didn't really think about coaches, right? You don't really think about, like, I got Lamar Jackson number 4, I got Kyler Murray number 5, I got Jalen Hurts number 6, I get these guys, and I'm thinking, well, Jalen Hurts could run, he's got great weapons on the outside, he can run the ball too. Russell Wilson, he usually runs the ball, he's got great weapons on the outside. Lamar Jackson, he gets loose. Justin Herbert, he's got Mike Williams, he's got Keenan Allen, he's got one of the best arms in the league. But now I'm gonna have to add, well, who's their play caller? Who's their head coach? How good is he with time management? How good is their offensive coordinator with getting their team to the red zone? How efficient are their offense? And as an aside, that's a great... Russell Wilson is almost like a poster child for why I'm doing this exercise, because I was so sure of him. He was almost like my break glass in case of emergency quarterback. I wanted to get maybe Josh or Patrick early, and then Jalen Hurts was my guy in the middle, and if I didn't get Hurts, I was going Russell Wilson. I was taking him no matter what. And I felt comfortable with that. I was like almost like good. But now, because of that miss, probably my biggest miss of the year, now I'm going to start to look at head coaches. Now I'm going to start to look at play callers and how many years they've been in that position. Is it a first-year play caller or is it a 15-year play caller? And I think that's important. And obviously it's important because when you look at Russell Wilson last year, you might have thought, Nathaniel Hackett, like, he's never really been a play caller before. Matt LaFleur called all the plays in Green Bay. Like, can he do it? Russell Wilson was given complete control of the offense, and you're just like, now looking back, you're kind of just like, obvious, right? But going back to that time, it wasn't. It was the complete opposite. So that's why he was one of the main reasons why I wanted to come back and do this exercise, because I think it's important. So that was an obvious thing. You know what? As I'm thinking here right now, look at play callers / coaches. I'm giving myself notes on the pod live on air. You don't get that anywhere else. So let's just run through. So that was like the gist of it. Number 8, I had Trey Lance. Now, Trey Lance, let's just see where he ended up finishing. Trey Lance. 63rd overall. Eesh. All right, he played 3 games. Let's cut him some slack. He played 1 game in the absolute rain, and then he played another game. I think he got hurt on the first play of the 3rd game, whatever. Why did I have Trey Lance there? Simple, rushing. I literally had Trey Lance there because of his rushing ability, his athletic tools, and here we go, actually, now kind of contradiction. Kyle Shanahan, and I feel like that's the easy one, though, because he's one of the best play callers in the league. So when you're on San Francisco, it's almost like, okay, you're going to have a real chance here. And they had a great running game. They had George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, all these guys. This is before Christian McCaffrey even got traded there. And I was all about the physical tools of Trey Lance and his rushing ability. I put him ahead of pocket passers like Tom Brady, who I had number 9, Aaron Rodgers, who I had at number 10, Kirk Cousins, who I had at number 11. I had Joe Burrow at number 12, which is just slimy, but we'll get to him. So that's why I had Trey Lance that high. It's going to be interesting to see where I end up slotting him in. It's going to be interesting to see where I end up slotting him this year because he was the number 13 quarterback off the board last year. And went before, some good quarterbacks, but was kind of a little bit lower, but still was 105th overall. Like, was still like a legit pick, wasn't like a last round break in case of emergency type quarterback. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But I think the injury kind of robbed us from seeing what he could potentially do on the big stage. Obviously for San Francisco, one of the best teams in the NFL. So, I just ran through some names there. I'll go 9 through 11 real quick. I had Tom Brady number 9, Aaron Rodgers number 10, and Kirk Cousins number 11. Tom Brady ended up finishing 12th, so I don't feel bad about that rank at all, actually. Tom Brady averaged 16.5 points per game. Their offense was clearly lacking, was not what it was the year previously. But he still went out and threw the 3rd most passing yards of any quarterback in the league. But what did we talk about earlier? The rushing. He had -1 rushing yards, and he had 1 rushing touchdown. So ended up getting 5 points from the ground, but still. He got the same amount of points on the ground from Andy Dalton, if that means anything. So he was 12, so I don't really feel terrible about that. I had Aaron Rodgers number 10. Rodgers finished at 13. Those were the 2 guys that were going really late that I feel like a lot of people were excited about. And Aaron Rodgers was absolutely brutal. Their offense as a whole was absolutely brutal. David Bakhtiari being out for a long stretch really hurt them. Their wide receivers not having Devontae Adams was obviously a huge loss for Rodgers. He only averaged 14.8 points per game. Played all 17 games. Same with Tom Brady. Now that he's in New York with the Jets, it's going to be interesting. I'm anticipating having him in a similar range as we get toward as we kind of get into July and we start to see training camp and I start to get those projections out. Those rankings. I'm kind of anticipating having him in the same range, along with the guy who I had at number 11, Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins actually finished as the number 7 quarterback in fantasy football this year. Threw for 4,500 yards, 29 touchdowns. He also ran 2 touchdowns had 97 yards on the ground, and scored 305 fantasy points, averaged 18 points per game. Was a top 10 guy, and deserves to be ranked ahead of guys like Aaron Rodgers, definitely like Trey Lance, Russell Wilson. He's earned it. The last couple of years, he's been a good fantasy quarterback. Throws it as much as any guy in the league. He had 5 less attempts than Patrick Mahomes, and he had about 40 less than, these guys were chucking the ball. So he was top 5 in attempts in the league. He's also got Justin Jefferson, probably the best wide receiver in the league on his team. So that helps. I could see him moving up there. Joe Burrow at number 12. That was bad. I'm just going to be honest. That was bad. Joe Burrow finished as the 4th quarterback in fantasy football last year. Threw for 4,500 yards, 36 touchdowns. Also ran for 5 touchdowns, 259 yards on the ground. So he added that element that I just frankly didn't see. I saw it was more I thought he was going to be 4,500 and 35 touchdowns, but I didn't see that extra 50-something points that he got from that. So him at 12 was just absolutely disrespectful, just to be flat out honest. And I will not be making that mistake again. no doubt about it. I only went 14 deep on these rankings. Number 13, I had Matthew Stafford, and number 14, I had Dak Prescott. Both guys were top 12 in terms of average draft position, so both guys were drafted to be starters. Dak got hurt, so he only played 12 games. Matt Stafford got hurt, and also just played really poor. He only played 9 games, so, wasn't great. He completed 68% of his passes, threw for 2,000 yards, only 10 touchdowns in the 9 games. Don't like to see that. Did have a rushing touchdown, but only 9 rushing yards. Average 12.9 fan. The offense in general for the Rams was not the same. Their offensive line was absolutely torn to shreds due to injuries, retirements, all the sites. And that was a big reason. He's going to be much lower in my ranks coming into this year. Although I do expect him to have a bounce back year for Los Angeles. So that's going to wrap up our ranks that I wrote. So now that we kind of talked about what I did last year, let's talk about just about a couple guys who broke into the top of the league, what I didn't even have on this list, right? So the first guy is Geno Smith, comeback player of the year. Threw for 4,200 yards and 30 touchdowns. Also had 366 yards on the ground. He was the number 5 quarterback in fantasy last year. He was the number 5 quarterback in fantasy. He averaged... what did he average? He averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game. Like, what else can you ask from a guy? And let's look at where he went in fantasy drafts. Oh my God. All right, hold on. I gotta count this. This is not good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Oh my gosh. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Oh my God. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 30. He was the 35th quarterback off the board. And he finished as quarterback number 5. Let's talk about he wasn't even drafted. He was an undrafted quarterback. Quarterbacks that were drafted ahead of him. Davis Mills, Carson Wentz, Zach Wilson, Kenny Pickett, Baker Mayfield, Mac Jones. Matt Ryan. So shout out to Geno, an absolute stud. I expect him to have as good a year this year. They go out and they had Jackson Smith and Jigba, first round pick from Ohio State, wide receiver. So they got him, DK, and Tyler Lockett. They also have Kenneth Walker, was an absolute stud last year at the running back position, a good offensive line. I expect him to have as good a year. I'm going to definitely write his name down just to remember, because he's gonna have to be a top 10 option coming into the year. The next name, Justin Fields, finished as the number 6 quarterback in fantasy, completing 60% of his passes and throwing for 2,200 yards and 17 touchdowns. Just for reference, Patrick Mahomes threw for 5,200 yards. He threw for 3,000 more passing yards and 24 more touchdowns. Now, he did have 120 more fantasy points. So let me bring it down a little bit. Okay, let's do the Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins finished 7th. Justin Fields finished 6th. Kirk Cousins threw for 2,300 more passing yards and 12 more touchdowns. How did Justin Fields outscore him? Justin Fields ran for 1,100 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. What? He broke Michael Vick's record for rushing at the quarterback position. He didn't even lead the league in rushing attempts from the quarterback. That was Jalen Hurts. Justin Fields was number 2. He ran for 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. Absolutely dominated on the ground. What does Chicago do? They get the number 1 overall pick. They trade it to Carolina. They get a number of picks. They also get DJ Moore in that deal. So just to bolster their wide receiver room. Khalil Herbert is scheduled to be like the lead running back there. If they didn't sign someone else, I have to check that. But I can expect more of the same from Fields. I don't think they'll run him as much, but I do expect him to take some steps as a passer, break 3,000 yards passing, hopefully break 20 touchdowns, and that should hopefully offset maybe a drop in rushing yards. I expect him to maybe even score more rushing touchdowns, which is a little aggressive considering he ran for 8 last year, but he's the type of athlete that I think can get that done. He was number 6 last year. He's going to have to be in consideration for the top 10 next season. And then the last name I'll touch on here, actually I'll touch on two more names. Trevor Lawrence was the 8th quarterback last year in fantasy football. He threw for 4,100 yards, 25 touchdowns. He also ran for 5 touchdowns and 290 yards like I talked about earlier. And what does Jacksonville get back this year? Calvin Ridley. I know a lot of people forgot. I forgot. They traded for him at the trade deadline last year while he was serving a year-long suspension for gambling on his own team. And what does he get back? He gets Calvin Ridley back along with a really great room. Like, they have a number of good options there. They have Evan Ingram at their tight end position. I believe he re-signed there. I might just be making stuff up. They have Travis Etienne out of the backfield. Most importantly, though, Doug Peterson as the play caller really empowered Trevor Lawrence to do a lot of good things and to be himself. Because Urban Meyer really didn't let that happen. T-Law is also going to be another guy that's going to push for that top 10. I mean, there's a lot of names that we're kind of starting to get into that changing of the guard with a lot of these quarterbacks that are starting to make their way in. T-Law is no different. And the last name I'll talk about, mainly because their team is gaining a lot of helium, and that is Jared Goff, quarterback for the Detroit Lions. He threw for 4,400 yards last year, 29 touchdowns. Had a very prolific year through the air. And did really well. I mean, they go out and what do? They draft Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round. They signed David Montgomery. They obviously trade away DeAndre Swift to, you guessed it, the Birds, obviously. But a two-headed monster of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be deadly. They lost DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams, so they're going to go whole new room there. But they also, have Jared Goff. They have Jameson Williams, who'll be coming into the year healthy. He'll be playing a full year under Detroit. They also have DJ Chark, I believe, still under contract. Obviously, they have Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the best wide receivers in the league. So they're going to be legit. They're going to be really legit. Obviously, Penei Sewell as their right tackle coming into more of his own. Their offensive line's really good. And he's going to be another interesting guy to rank because I think a lot of people are going to have him low coming into the year. I mean, just looking at, this list, where did Jared Goff, the only two quarterbacks were Carson Wentz and Davis Mills. Every other quarterback after those three were undrafted. He went behind guys like Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones actually finished ahead of him. But he went behind Marcus Mariota, Zach Wilson, Ryan Tannehill, Kenny Pickett, Baker Mayfield, Deshaun Watson, Matt Ryan, Mac Jones, Jameis Winston. And then you get to Trevor Lawrence, and that's the first guy that finished ahead of him. So you're talking about a guy who vastly overproduced his ADP. And I could see him being another guy who does that this year. So we're going to keep tabs on him as the offseason progresses. I'm really, really excited to continue this series. I'm going to jump into running backs next, which is everybody's favorite, and then jump into wide receivers after that. Didn't do tight end rankings. I just don't really feel like I am educated enough on tight ends and / there's enough good tight ends to make a good list. So I just keep it to quarterback, running back, and wide receiver. This is obviously the quarterback episode. We're going to have a running back and wide receiver coming soon. So definitely keep your ears to the street for those episodes coming out. But that is going to do it for the show today. Once again, check the description for our social media handles. Also, feel free to shoot us questions, guys. We'll always answer them here on air if there's any that you have, and we'll answer it on the show. But once again, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here again next time.